Welcome to Fringe Pop 321, the show that believes the world is stranger than we think, but thinking should not be strange. We are back as part of our interview series with Dr. Judd Burton. And Judd, we always need to introduce you at least for the first of a series. So can you tell viewers a little bit about yourself to start off here? What your fields are, your degrees, and so on and so forth.
The alphabet soup after my name.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah, I'm primarily a classical early Christian historian. I have a PhD in history with a focus in religion. I've also got a master's degree in anthropology, both of those from Texas Tech, with cultural and archaeological training.
And you taught anthropology, you taught some world civ, a little bit of everything.
Right, history, archaeology, mythology. If it's within the humanities, I probably taught it.
Okay. Well, today we want to talk a little bit about zombies. And, this isn't going to be a show about certain episodes of The Walking Dead and all that.
But why not?
Right. Why not? What's the harm? What could go wrong? Right. We want to talk a little bit about the non-Hollywood stuff, because this has it's not as long as some of the other things we've talked about. The lore of this isn't quite so lengthy in antiquity, but this has a long history. Other than what we're sort of familiar with Hollywood. So can you get us into that? Give us a little bit of a sketch as to historically in terms of folklore and your ethnology and these sorts of things. What were zombies? Like, where does this come from, this whole idea?
Well, zombies, of course, that's a word that's very emotive and pregnant with meaning. When people hear it, we're so tuned in.
Our brain just fills that in.
It fills that in with stuff from pop culture for the most part. If we want to talk about the lore and look at zombies in terms of history and anthropology, the place to really start is within the bounds of Afro-Caribbean tradition. And of course, those have roots, going back older to older. But if we maximize the term zombie, we can include a host of different subspecies, if you will, of these kinds of
like if you just
creatures.
Make it something pretty broad, like undead.
Right, right. And in fact, the old, the words in Eastern Europe, Nosferatu, undead, the vampires that were sort of under that heading were kind of zombie-like. They were revenants. They were these sort of mindless, non-sentient, subservient kinds of things, only driven by, in the case of Eastern vampires, the thirst for blood and human flesh. And you can sort of, that sort of mindlessness extends to the zombie. And in the case of the zombie, the tradition of Vodun or voodoo, or some of its other variants in Afro-Caribbean religions, you've got, Santeria and Candomblé, there's a host of those, but they all share similarities. They're syncretistic, so they have Catholic elements, but they also have these African, indigenous elements as well.
Is there a connection to like the slave trade? Just sort of the for lack of a better term, the whole slave trade where you have slaves essentially work to death, or they're essentially, like zombie-like. I mean, it's just they're essentially waiting to die, and all this sort of thing. Does it have anything to do with that, just the industry, the conditions of the people? Because you're talking about these Caribbean places, and it's hard to divorce that from...
Sure. I would say less so in regards to that, and more so into the fact that of course, the slave trade was a conduit for bringing those sorts of elements of culture over. And when they arrive in the New World, of course, they're adapted for use there. And in fact, you can look at the archaeological record in the case of slaves all over the Americas, and you'll find that well into the 1800s, while you have an element of Christianity, and of course some of them are evangelized heavily, there's still a large portion of them that practice these African-based religions. And of course, Vodun was one of them, or one form or another. The zombie itself is a a minion, and not the little one-eyed
Right.
yellow
guys.
Yeah.
They're a little too lively.
Right, a little too lively, probably a little too nice for the job description too. But the zombie is a servant, of a controller, one of a host of these priests within the context of Vodun and these other Afro-Caribbean religions.
So would you have a situation where a shaman or some other, again, priestly figure would, revive, a dead person? I mean, is this the idea to be a
right? That's
a slave?
That's the idea. But in order to to preserve that position of power, it's the image of bringing someone back in the case of Vodun, because there's a specific substance that's concocted by the Hogan or any other priestly figure. And in the case of the Caribbean, that's a mixture that includes an extract from the puffer fish, tetrodotoxin, which basically slows the metabolism down to non-existent. And the practitioner will go back and find the person, and the community is like, oh my gosh, you brought this guy back to life.
Yeah. So it could actually produce. I mean, what you're saying is there's some means to produce a death-like condition,
right?
And then declare the person dead, then bring them back.
That's
and,
right.
That sort of thing. And so they're essentially under control by whatever mechanism they're using.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you? I mean, is this sort of a? I mean, I'm wondering what the purpose is. I'm sure it could be wide open. I mean, even if you never had your zombie do anything, if the community thinks you can do this, then that elevates your status in the community.
Exactly.
But other than just sort of pure status seeking, what would be the some of the purposes?
Well, there are a myriad of purposes. They could retribution against it could be retribution against that person in particular. It could simply be to accomplish a task that this individual doesn't have time for. Now, this depending on the volatility of the mixture, you're talking about some neurological damage here. And in fact, there are case studies of people who have been subjected to the famed zombie powder, and they're never really the same, just in terms of their mental faculties.
So, I mean, the whole zombie powder thing is something I want to drill down on, because that that sort of drifts off into the pop culture, and that research in and of itself is really controversial. But since we're here a little bit, when you get this sort of situation, how, I mean, it has to be surreptitious, that the person doesn't know, or that the person is sort of made, put into this condition and whatnot. I mean, how is this done? Because you would think, after a while, that people would sort of catch on to something, or do they really think it's magical?
Well, in most cases, it's such a culturally constrained idea that they do think it's magical. The administration of this concoction is generally opportunistic. It could be as easy as one of these practitioners passing an individual on the street and then blowing the powder at them very quickly. That way that they walk into the cloud and absorb it into their lungs.
Inhale it,
Right. And once it hits the lung tissue, actualizing that into their metabolism is pretty quick. And it's usually timed, so it'll it looks like the person dies as the results.
Right. Yeah, and I guess that because again, if somebody sees that happen, you would think that our shaman here did something to this guy to turn him into this, and you could see how that would be interpreted as, again, like a potion or magical. But of course, to really get the most out of it, they'd have to think that the guy was dead,
right? And
then he's brought back,
right.
That sort of thing.
Exactly.
So, where do we get, in a historical sense, where do we get cures? Like can zombies ever be brought out of their zombie-like state, or do you essentially have to die and now you're at rest? I mean, what did people think?
Well, death, of course, can be a curative in that regard. And in the case of the zombies that we're talking about, we're looking at a kind of zombie by design. These are revenants by design. There are other kinds of creatures like this in other parts of the world. We mentioned Eastern Europe, where there are apotropaics for dispatching these kinds of creatures. The use of herbs, and in the case of the undead of Eastern Europe, the apotropaics used for vampires apply. They're typically within cultural confines.
You might want to define apotropaic.
It's a means of repelling or destroying whatever threat these particular folkloric creatures.
Right, and it could be a ritual. It could be verbal. It could involve something.
It could be a talisman. It could be something physical. Yeah.
Again, in this part of the world, I mean, how prevalent do we get a sense of this? Like when is it when do you first hear about it? Does it have like a heyday? Does it pick up? Is it still around today? That sort of thing.
Well, on this side of the globe, certainly it's got now its roots, of course, are largely pre-literate. This taking it back to Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and probably West Africa specifically. The quantifiable elements of it begin to show up in records, and some of them are anecdotal, but they talk about, they describe some of the rituals, particularly in slave communities. And of course, there's a whole sub-discipline of archaeology that's devoted to learning about slave culture. And so the kinds of trinkets that are associated with Afro-Caribbean religions turn up in the archaeological record and tell us about it. But if we're looking at just documents and material, we're talking about within the last 550 years. The colonial history, in other words. And as to your second point, it is still around.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's not an unreasonable thing, to hear, because, again, given the conditions of certain, cultures, people that are essentially cut off from the world, cut off from education, cut off from, medical, I mean, a whole host of things that we just sort of take for granted in the modern West. You could see how this would function. I've read that in some cases, again, back you mentioned the colonial era, you would have, before you sort of get the shamanistic hocus pocus kind of thing going on, that it was actually part of a sort of slave religion. Like they're looking for death as a release, and if you die a certain way or a noble way, then heaven for you is going to go back to Africa, back to your home country, and your ancestors and whatnot. But then if you commit suicide, that was, again, in some cultures, that was still viewed so negatively that you wouldn't get to go back, to your homeland and your ancestors. You would essentially have to stay here, and then you would be in this like zombie-like state. In other words, it's like you're being a slave forever.
Sure.
So we see that as well, in these traditions. I mean, how long does
that? Yes.
Where's the transition? Because you have the slave. One is kind of like a slave origin,
right,
and the other one you could see, again, not that it's not a slave origin, because if it comes from African religion, but you have an opportunistic person within the community trying to sort of control the idea.
It begins to evolve. The whole system has to adapt to a new set of rules. It has to adapt to an entirely new cultural ecology, if you will. Naturally, those ideas that have roots in Africa, they're going to take on a different shape within the confines of slave culture. And that's why I referenced the colonial era, because we do have records, and archaeology helps to shed some light on that. And as the brutality of slavery became such an integral part of these people's lives, well, naturally, the conditions that they're living under,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the
It's going to become part of the whole mindset.
the vicissitudes far outweigh the blessings of whatever life that they happen to be living, and those kinds of experiences are going to shape a wide variety of cultural ideas, including death,
Mm-hmm.
including you know, death as a curative, death as a release, and certainly the zombie is a kind of analog for a death that would occur at the end of a life ill spent.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody who in the case of slave culture, bore up under the brutality and the suffering, as you say, would have a noble end. But yeah, the specialists within these communities certainly would view the zombie as a kind of analog for, you know, the slave culture in general, because those ideas and likely those practices existed already in Africa before they were brought over.
Somebody's going to fill that slot.
Right, exactly. And it's going, you know, it will take on the whole cultural toolkit, if you will take on the hues of this new cultural ecology that they find themselves in.
Yeah, when we come back, we're going to wrap up our discussion here. But when we come back, I mean, you mentioned a few things that I want to pick up in another, you know, conversation.
Okay.
The whole discovery of the drug element here. You mentioned the puffer fish, and then sort of, you and I both know that actually sort of, it doesn't start, but it really accelerates certain things that we would be familiar with today in terms of the, you know, pop culture with zombies. It's definitely a contributor, you know, so that you get an instance where academic research actually sort of fuels, you know, how this is treated in pop culture.
Right.
So, but we'll hit that when we come back. Thanks for being with us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks for watching this episode of Fringe Pop. Please visit our website, fringepop321.com. And if you're interested in supporting what we're doing at Fringe Pop, go to fp321.com/S. That's the letter S as in Sam. And come back and watch other episodes, because what you know may not be so.